Namaste, welcome to this episode of Clear Cut with J. Sai Deepak. We released a video recently on the Citizenship Amendment Act, which got insanely viral, and naturally it raised a lot of questions. And so we decided we'll do a quick conversation with Sai Deepak and address some of the issues that have come up after people have watched the video. And also, I'd like to push this further into the larger civilizational context of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the NRC that is supposed to follow. Welcome to the show, Sai Deepak.
Thank you.
So let's begin straight away with your earlier video. I'd like to go a little deeper, in fact, much deeper than what was discussed, what you mentioned in the video. So could you quickly summarize your position on the act for those of the viewers who have missed it?
Actually, I'd like to give a bit more of context as to why I felt that perhaps that clarification was necessary. I was getting at least phone calls from 2 or 3 friends who were practicing Muslims and who were aware of the fact that I had spoken on the issue of NRC, I had spoken on the issue of illegal migration, I had spoken on the issue of the Citizenship Amendment Bill, erstwhile bill, and they had watched these videos. They were aware of my views as well. And they asked me if there is any reason for the fear or the apprehension that was being, caused by certain sections of the society, especially perhaps even the media. And they wanted to know what are the documents that their relatives must be ready with should there be a nationwide NRC. And these were advocates for all practical purposes. So I had to tell them, guys, you're advocates. Please take a look at it. Please tell me where is this entire fear coming from. So I asked them, what is the source of this particular fear mongering? They said these are local, voices which are actually spreading this kind of information among people in villages and districts on the hinterland, so to speak, or maybe the second tier cities or third tier cities. So that's one of the reasons that I decided that perhaps this was necessary, this clarification was necessary, so that this fear mongering can be put to rest to a significant extent. So the sum and substance of my position in the last video. First of all, even before I proceed to summarize it, I think this clarification is warranted. That this video was not an impromptu talk based on any 5-minute reading or 10-minute reading or last-minute reading. People are aware of the fact that I've spoken on this issue at least since 2017, where I did a fairly longish talk for Srijan on the question of illegal migration, as well as touching upon the issue of Rohingyas, which was then hot news. Then subsequently, I've spoken on that particular issue as part of Indus Talks, Center for Indic Studies. I've also spoken on this particular issue as part of a talk delivered at Nagpur to an enlightened audience earlier this year. I have publicly taken part in a debate with Professor Faizan Mustafa and Advocate Aman Wadood. This was just a few months ago in September, or rather in fact October 15th, in the backdrop of the outcome of the NRC in Assam. And this was before an enlightened audience from Nalsar, Hyderabad, one of India's foremost legal institutions, law schools for that particular matter, and which regularly produces some of the finest brains who represent the country even outside. So I subjected myself to every possible kind of scrutiny and had opened myself to all kinds of questions. And therefore, it wasn't as if I was suddenly looking for some kind of popularity or some kind of publicity of 5 minutes of fame. Each of these videos had accumulated close to at least 30,000-40,000 views. And given the nature of the topic and given the seriousness of the topic, it was natural that not everybody was going to watch it. And yet, these videos had gained considerable traction. So my talk had to be, or rather the last video that we had, is to be seen in that particular context. And I'd taken part at least in 3 debates on Rajasbha TV on this particular issue, where my views are very, very clear because that particular forum allows me to explain my position in detail. So the position is as follows. 1, the Citizenship Amendment Act is a legislation which provides a healing touch to specific communities, 6 communities, coming from 3 different countries who are commonly tied by the strain or by the thread of the fact that they're all Islamic republics. according to their constitutions. Whether there is a correlation or a causality between their, let's say, their religious identity and the persecution that these communities were suffering is not an issue that I was getting into at all. The focus was very simple, that they were being targeted for their religion, and that much was very clear. And the fact that this has been the subject of discussion for a very long time. In fact, there is a committee report in the backdrop of the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2003, where several members, leading members of the Congress, including senior advocates who represent them in the court and elsewhere, were members of this particular committee. So there was a detailed discussion. And Sri Manmohan Singh had also contributed to that when he was part of the particular opposition. And when these gentlemen...
Opposition of the government?
No, 2003.
Oh, okay.
2003. So when these gentlemen were actually commenting on the question of minorities in Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, the discussion makes it abundantly clear that they were referring to religious minorities. So today when people try and obfuscate the issue that why is minority only a religious minority and not, let's say, a sectarian minority, the entire discussion has always been in the backdrop of religious minorities. That much is very, very clear from the discussion. Subsequently, again, there was a letter that was sent by Sri Prakash Karat of the CPIM in June 2012, where he writes a letter to the then Prime Minister Sri Manmohan Singh, specifically highlighting the status of persecuted religious minorities in Bangladesh. And he also draws attention to the fact that most of these minorities who come from the Hindu community are from, let's say, the Dalit community or the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes. He highlights the specific and the names of the castes themselves. So I'm assuming that since Hinduism is the only religion that is infected with caste and all that, clearly when they're identifying caste, they were clearly referring only to the Hindu minorities and nobody else. That much is clear, right? So that was one thing that I wanted to highlight, which is that there is a specific metric, there is a specific identified standard, there is a yardstick and a benchmark which has been identified for the purposes of a limited intervention, okay? And therefore, since the class of people has been reasonably identified on the basis of persecution which is religious in nature, it passes muster on the annals of Article 14. Unfortunately, people have been watching this video and these talks in silos. Therefore, they've asked me, do you believe that Article 14 does not even apply? My position has not been that Article 14 does not apply to the discussion. I am saying objections on the basis of Article 14 don't hold water because it satisfies every test that the Supreme Court has laid down with respect to Article 14. The second position that I'd also come out with is when you start a discussion with respect to citizenship, illegal migrants, refugees, aliens and whatnot, or foreigners so to speak, you have to first refer to the specific provision of the Constitution that deals with the issue of citizenship, namely Part 2, Articles 5 to 11. And then you read it along with the Citizenship Act, then you read it along with the Foreigners Act, and then you apply the test of Article 14. The reason why I specifically said that this must be the approach is that the scope of discretion, the scope of prerogative that is available to the executive changes from subject to subject. And when it comes to the issue of citizenship, when it comes to the issue of refugees, when it comes to the issue of illegal migrants, the executive has been given certainly more than ordinary scope of power. Therefore, it is slightly extraordinary in nature in terms of the discretion. Therefore, even judicial intervention when it comes to these matters is very, very limited. That much has come out from several judgments of the Supreme Court, of the Delhi High Court and whatnot. So that was the basic object. 3, I struck a distinction between, as a corollary to the first point, sectarian persecution and religious persecution. I also made the clear point that India has the right to ask itself that when it invites Pakistani Muslim communities into this country en masse or en bloc and gives them the same treatment as these 6 communities, what does it do to the safety of people in this particular country, Hindus, Muslims, regardless of whoever it may be? Because when people can take the position that Assamese, regardless of their faith, have a problem with Bangladeshis, whoever comes from, whether it's a Hindu or a Muslim, then it must be understood that regardless of who comes in, it could have, people in India, both Hindus and Muslims could have a problem with who comes in from that particular community, especially if they have an animus towards India in general and specifically towards 80% of the population. If Pakistani Muslims or specific communities within the Pakistani Muslim society have an animus towards the Pakistani Hindu, are we being told that they are bound to have greater affection for the Indian Hindu?
No, I think the point that they are raising is that there is a spectrum of communities or sects within Islam in Pakistan.
Right.
And some of them are persecuted, and therefore, how can we deny them entry? So, how would you respond to that?
See, for that, the answer, and I've said this both on the Times Now debate as well as in the Rajya Sabha TV debate and every other place, to basically say whether a community which is being persecuted on a sectarian basis deserves to be given citizenship or refugee status in India. India cannot apply the same uniform yardstick, because it has to ask itself, whatever may be the reason within that particular community in that particular country, what threat would it pose to India when it comes to India, to Indian population? That is a legitimate metric and a legitimate consideration which Indian government has the right to factor in as part of these considerations. Now people ask, okay, so this point comes from vacuum, where is the legal support for this particular point? The legal support for this particular point comes from what? I've said this before, that the law on refugees in India is not governed by a statute, it is governed by a standard operating procedure dated the 29th of December 2011, which this government continues to adopt, and one has to just search for standard operating procedure, law on refugees India on Google. A Press Information Bureau release dated I think August 2014 of Shri Kiren Rijiju is available, which clearly says that India continues to follow that particular policy. And under that particular standard operating procedure, they need to go through a security verification before they decide to bestow that status for refugeeship. I am asking myself this simple question. If citizenship is a notch and several notches higher than refugeeship, if you end up giving a certain, so if the security protocols which you follow with respect to refugee status, wouldn't you follow at the very least the same protocols for citizenship? That is the logic. Now, to which a lot of people have said, look, Ahmadiyas may have taken a certain position when it comes to 1946 during the creation of Pakistan. But over the years, their attitudes have changed. Frankly, and then in fact, they even make the statement that there are Ahmadiyas in India. Okay, so what do you make of that? Then you have to go back to the straightforward argument that it has always been your position, it's always been everybody's position, that no, there is something called as the Indian version of Islam, and that's one of the reasons that they chose to stay back in this country overnight, okay, despite the elections of 1946. And therefore, you must strike a distinction between the secular, peace-loving nature of, let's say, Indian Muslim communities and those communities which put stock in the two-nation theory, which reside in erstwhile Pakistan, which is Bangladesh, East Pakistan, as well as current-day Pakistan. Now, how do you establish whether or not that animus is continued? You establish that on the basis of the dwindling figures of non-Muslim communities in both these countries. If there is a significant fall in these populations, then what explains that particular fall in population? The funny part is, prior to this government actually passing this particular legislation, the previous dispensations have recognized the existence of religious persecution, but suddenly that has become a taboo because of this particular dispensation. Why should the facts change merely because the dispensations have changed? To which the allegation is, oh, so you're a stooge of the government. That seems to be the allegation. Here's the surprising part. If you happen to oppose the policy of the government, does it necessarily make you a stooge of the opposition? If the answer is a no, supporting the government's position doesn't make you a stooge of the government's position, but it makes you a votary of that particular issue. Therefore, so for instance, you know this for a fact, on Uniform Civil Code, when the last time we spoke on Clear Cut, I've clearly said that I disagree with the government on Uniform Civil Code.
Absolutely.
That it could affect Indian cultural, religious, traditional diversity, and that perhaps a lot of communities will have to sacrifice, and I even made the blunt point that perhaps the majority community will have to make a lot more sacrifices on the anvils or at the altar of this Uniform Civil Code. Therefore, my approach has been very clearly an issue-based approach, where I've disagreed with the government on multiple occasions, where in front of elected representatives of this government, I've openly said that your governments need to vacate temples and lead by example. So that is a position that I've taken uniformly.
In fact, you called it a loser's argument.
Exactly. I called the Uniform Civil Code a loser's argument very clearly. So that's my response.
No, so it's interesting that you bring in, you mention Ahmadiyas here, and I've heard this argument a number of times.
Right.
And people always crying about, making statements about Ahmadiyas being persecuted in Pakistan. I think they do have my empathy, but
Right.
We cannot forget the historical context. And I don't see any evidence for them having changed their stance.
Correct.
For example, if we go back to pre-independence history, in 1940, the Lahore Resolution for the creation of Pakistan was drafted by Ahmadiyas.
Right.
In 1946, 1947, Ahmadiyas were the ones who formed the Ahmadiyya militia. What was it called? Furqan? No, that was Ahmadiyya militia in 1946-47. And post-partition, they created the Furqan force. And Furqan force was called Khuddam-e-Deen, which means that it was an army constituted of university students who were responding to the call of jihad.
Right.
So, I mean, clearly it is a security threat for India. Ahmadiyas, bringing in Ahmadiyas, we cannot personally verify every single individual where his loyalties lie.
That's precisely
And
the
when
point.
dealing with the collective, you have to deal with a collective as a single unit. You cannot break it down and go down to the individual level and say that no, this individual is nice, this individual is bad, right? So that sort of logic somehow seems to be missing in the public discourse.
See, here's the funny part. When it comes to Rohingyas who flee Myanmar, people are more than happy to recognize the fact that the cause of the persecution is religious, and they are more than happy to identify, or they're more than happy to make the statement that people are being persecuted en masse merely because they are Rohingyas, and they're more than happy to impute all sorts of motives to the rest of the communities as a group. It's not on an individual basis, right? So surprisingly, the question that's being asked here, and this was atrocious, I found it so atrocious, the question that they're asking is, how do you know for a fact that every Hindu who is going to benefit from the Citizenship Amendment Act is necessarily suffering from religious persecution on an individual basis? Can every Hindu establish that? Going by that logic, you should never bring up the concept of 2002. Yeah. You should never talk about Kashmiri Pandits. You should never talk about what happened with the Sikhs in Delhi. So how do you establish that? You go on the basis of what Aristotle called the essentialist perspective. When you try and take a look at something, you effectively go on the basis of what is the essence of that particular attitude, what is the pattern that is discernible. Because if this is the kind of analysis that they wish to come out with, then none of these people should ever speak of Muslim being persecuted in India as a community, as a group, or any other community for that particular matter, when it comes to caste or when it comes to religion. Frankly speaking, I think the standards of discourse, the standards of analysis, the abysmal standards have been exposed by this particular issue entirely.
True.
So in fact, the funny part is, they start their debate with the assumption that this is a saffron position, that this is a position which is in aid of the government's position, that this is bigotry at the heart of it, and there's nothing more to it. How is it bigoted to actually point out that this was exactly the cause of a certain persecution, and that persecution continues to exist and thrive and kick, and that it is alive for people to see? That there are any number of reports. So for instance, I was just taking a look at this website, which has been set up by Ahmadiyas of Pakistan. They open their entire introduction as being the founding communities of Pakistan. They openly say we were the ones to constitute this particular country. We actually played a greater role than any other community, and that this was possible only because of our religious faith and whatnot. If that is their continued position, are we now going to deny the religious basis of the partition, the two-nation theory? Then you're also going to deny people like Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar, in his book Pakistan or the Partition of India, elaborates in fantastic scholarly erudite detail what is the religious thought behind this partition. Are we going to deny all of this? So it's surprising that when it comes to Article 370, the same set of people say, don't forget the history of Article 370, don't look at the Constitution in isolation. Similarly, when it comes to the issue of citizenship, which is even more fundamental, you're certainly expected to take a look at the history. The history of animus between communities, the history of animus between two different countries, all that has to be looked at.
So since we're talking about history, I want you to speak on when we talk about the Constitution, right? So the Constitution has its own set of standards, its own logic, its own morality, and there are forces of history that are at play.
Right.
So how do you reconcile the two?
See, the first point I think that needs to be made very clearly is that the Constitution is not just any book. It's not just any legislation. The text cannot be read, dehorsed the context. You cannot divorce it from the context. You cannot divorce it from the subtext or the backdrop. So the people who are citing Article 14 saying this is the language, okay, in which case, where do you derive this concept of constitutional morality? Where is that word even used in the Constitution? where is basic structure used in the constitution, right? And if secularism was not there until 1976, until the 42nd Amendment, and yet the court has come to the conclusion that secularism continues to be one of the abiding principles of the Indian Constitution, that is between 1950 and 1976. Where is it getting all of this from? That means there is a certain manner in which this particular book is supposed to be read. I'm sorry if it comes across as elitist, but I make no bones about the fact that this requires a specialized qualification, that this requires a specialized treatment. And that is precisely why people spend years and years trying to read this book. Why do you have constitutional experts if everybody can pass off as an expert? I can't call myself a constitutional expert even today, and I don't think I should. It takes a lot more of experience under your belt. You should have spent a lot more time writing, reading, and talking about that particular thing and putting it in action in court. Only then you get to call yourself an expert. Today, I am merely a practitioner of constitutional law who believes strongly that this book needs to be understood better. So that's point number one. Point number two, that book is not static. It is rigid in parts thanks to the basic structure doctrine, which the Supreme Court came out with on the 24th of April 1973 in the Keshavananda Bharati judgment. And in certain other parts, it is transient. What makes it transient? Politics, will of the people. All of that translates to what? History. So are you going to divorce the changes or the transition that the Constitution goes through completely from the history which is responsible or which triggers that particular transition? Today, when we speak of Assam, is it possible to look at any provision of the Constitution which deals with Assam or even the Citizenship Act without looking at the Assam Accord? That is a watershed moment in Indian history because indigenous sentiments were captured in a political accord between the center and the state based on a student movement. That is part of Indian history. Now, is it possible to interpret any provision of the Constitution that relates to Assam or deals with Assam by divorcing it completely from the Assam Accord? It's not possible, right? So, I've said this even in my talk in Bangalore on 370, that the more you read the Constitution, you realize it's important to read the history of the Constitution. There is so much to it that it's not sufficient to just know the provisions, the sections, the clauses. That's not what constitutional law, in fact, that's not how even law is supposed to be approached, okay? So, according to me, the document needs to be seen in the context of history. Now, my position has always been that the Constitution is a civilizational document. So people might say, where do you get this from? Where does it say? So some people end up making the statement that the Constitution is a feminist document. Where are they getting this from? I don't understand, right? So you're pushing a certain point of view because you believe that this is how it is supposed to be read. I'm pushing a certain point of view, but I have greater basis, greater foundations, and greater factual basis to make the particular statement. Because when it specifically, and I've said this ad nauseum ad infinitum, that when it uses the word Bharat in Article 1, it is not a casual statement. It is not a casual hat tip to the civilizational heritage that you have inherited. If you look at how this particular document goes about even speaking of protection of cows, okay, which constitution speaks of protection of cows unless and until you're actually harking back to a certain civilizational memory, a certain belief, right? These are aspects. In fact, when this constitution, its original manuscript was being displayed, if you take a look at it, fundamental duties effectively has Lord Ram at the top of it. In fact, they commissioned a specific artist for this. In fact, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, the Minister for Law and Justice, he was actually disclosing all of this to the public, and he asked himself this question. If this particular constitution were to be written today, would it be possible for us to have any of those inscriptions and any of those paintings? Because having Lord Ram in that particular book would amount to violation of canons of secularism according to people who believe in a certain warped notion of secularism, right? The bottom line, according to me, is not about the law. It is not about the interpretation of the law. It is a fundamentally, let's say, it's a fundamental ideological gulf. And people are beating around the bush on that particular point. Everybody has a certain position and they are generating legal arguments to support that particular position. Okay. However, in the process, the kind of intellectual skullduggery that you're committing with respect to provisions of the Constitution, with respect to how those provisions have been interpreted by the Supreme Court is astounding. Therefore, according to me, at least be honest about the fact that this is your ideological position. Okay? Let your intent be clear and then let's focus on the merits of your content.
No, I take the point on there being an ideological gulf.
Right.
But if we were to frame this debate in as much objectivity as possible,
Right.
then I think, again, going back to the historical context, I think this has to be looked at in the context of the Liaquat-Nehru Pact,
Correct.
where, as you mentioned, the
Hostage theory.
critical hostage theory,
Right.
where India and Pakistan, because they got divided along religious lines,
Right.
and they kept a certain, by virtue of their own natures,
Right.
there were more Hindus who displaced from Pakistan and
Right.
lesser Muslims from India.
Right.
But they kept a certain number of people in their countries, and the pact was that you will not hurt your minorities.
Right.
Now, in the event that Pakistan persecuted the Hindus, the response from India, a vile response would have been that we persecute Muslims.
Correct.
However, because we are a civilized nation,
Correct.
we decide that we will not persecute anyone, but we will invite the persecuted communities back to India.
Exactly.
And I think that pretty much sums the whole issue. Now, looking at the larger picture, right, where you talk about the civilizational responsibility and all, I think the accusation on the government is totally baseless, because the government is talking about the historical context.
Right.
It is the public, like people like me, who see this as a civilizational issue. The government has nowhere explicitly said that they are going to, they're going to become the homeland for Hindus
Right.
as yet.
Right.
I hope they would, personally speaking.
Natural
but,
homeland for Hindus,
yeah,
but not only for Hindus.
yeah,
Right.
but that's not, yeah, correct. And it makes complete sense, because if there's if tomorrow there is a persecution of Hindus in Guyana, for example,
Right.
where would that person go?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
On the other hand, any Muslim, right, when we saw the Syrian crisis, everyone pointed out to the hypocrisy of the Arabic world,
Right.
where they did not take a single refugee. And these guys ended up in Europe. Now, the question that I ask is, why, when a Muslim is persecuted, why doesn't the Islamic world open its doors?
Right. So, in fact, just to draw back this conversation or actually bring it back to the question of this critical hostage theory, I'll tell you the kind of comments, some of them actually how I received. In fact, one gentleman sitting in New Jersey wrote on Facebook, where is this critical hostage theory mentioned in the Liaquat Ali Pact, on the Liaquat-Nehru Pact of 1950? I don't find it at all. This is humbug. I wasn't sure, should I laugh, should I cry at the stupidity of this argument? Because is somebody going to actually write in the pact what is the thought behind their position? See, here's the funny part. In fact, Venkat Tulipala's book, Creating New Medina, that's precisely why I think this book was necessary. He highlights, and if you look at the index, there is a specific portion that deals with hostage population theory, and which is effectively what I was talking about. And in multiple pages, he elaborates on the fact that when the Muslim League was selling the concept of and the idea of Pakistan to the Muslim populations, especially in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and other places, they realized that they were not going to be able to convince every Muslim from this country to move to that particular place for multiple reasons. Convenience was a huge reason, not always patriotism. Why would you leave everything in this particular country and go when you've settled here for generations, especially when you think that you have lorded over this particular place? Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, therefore, how did Pakistan sell this particular concept that they would have Hindu and Sikh population, at least in some numbers, to be held as hostages should the Indian government decide to persecute the Muslim minorities of India? Now, you effectively see the rest of the world in your own shade. Therefore, Pakistan assumed that merely because it was going to persecute its own non-Muslim minorities, India was going to do the same with respect to non-Hindu minorities. That was effectively how they saw it. And therefore, they decided to sell the proposition. So, that is the level of the debate that I have seen so far. Second, you have to ask yourself this simple question, okay? Are you now going to take the position that Indian secularism or Indian brand of secularism effectively requires you to hogwash and or rather whitewash entire history, and also give Pakistan, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, this seal of approval that it is as secular as India? That's point number two. Point number three, you're now being told the victim who comes into India as a consequence of religious persecution must not even identify the cause of that particular persecution. This would amount to, according to me, a crime in countries like, let's say, Austria or Germany, where if people deny the Holocaust, it amounts to a crime. Absolutely. Okay? The absence of a Holocaust-related legislation in this country, which effectively stops people from making this insensitive, apathetic denial, I think is partly the reason. People must have a right to point out what happened to them and why did they actually come to this particular place.
Right.
Okay? So that's point number 3. Point number 4, according to me, is, see, since India is not going to persecute its minorities merely because Hindu minorities are being persecuted in Pakistan, India could have effectively said, if you're not in a position to take care of your population and they come to me, I want some portion of your land. Okay? Right. And if India is also expected to take on persecuted sectarian minorities such as Ahmadiyya, Shias and Sufis, why should it do so without asking for more land? The specific object of asking for that land on both flanks of India was to say that we need this to house a Muslim majority population. If that Muslim majority population and portions of it start trickling into India for whatever reason, why should India not ask for more land? Because you set it up as an Islamic republic, not as a secular republic. If you had set it up as a secular republic, then India has perhaps no basis to make that particular claim. But you set it up as a Muslim republic or an Islamic republic and you start persecuting certain Muslim sects, then India must say, fine, I'll take care of them, but give me the resources as well.
It is very interesting that you bring up this idea of land acquisition and expanding our territory in order to accommodate more people. Because a lot of people have also said that, look, we are barely surviving ourselves.
Right.
There's unemployment, there's a lot of poverty, and why should we take more people?
Right.
But I would like to just read out a few statistics about the other part of this
Right.
problem, which is the Bangladesh border.
Right.
So I'll just read out a few facts and then put that in perspective.
Right.
2/3 of Bangladesh is just 5 meters above sea level.
Right.
28% of the population is coastal, and which also happens to be the most economically most vibrant zone of Bangladesh. So their economy is quite dependent on these coastal areas.
Right.
It is estimated that by 2050, 17% of their land will submerge because of the rising sea levels, and 18 million people will get displaced. Another estimate says that by 2100 AD, 13 feet rise of the sea level is expected, which is 4 times more than the global average.
I see.
Which means that by 2050, their own people, their own scientists and social scientists have estimated that 50 million people would flee from the country, right? Now look at this in context with, again, in the historical backdrop.
Right.
When India was being divided, when the concept of Pakistan was being conceptualized, at that time, in the imagination of the Muslims, and specifically the Muslim League, India and the divided India would constitute of 5 portions: Hindustan, Pakistan, Bangalistan, Dravidistan, and Rajasthan.
Right.
Bengalistan also encompassed the entire Assam,
Right.
and not the present day Assam, but the entire northeast, because that was Assam in pre-independence India. So in their imagination, they are already looking at Assam as a part of their own territory. And now that they have a crisis, a severe environmental crisis, which has nothing to do with any ideology, they're looking to settle people in their greater territory, which is Assam, and they've been doing this systematically. I don't know how people just deny this basic objective fact, which is devoid of any ideology. It is for them to see.
See, what has happened in this entire debate is emotions and hyperbole and exaggeration use of words like disaster, and this is a calamity, that this is a Holocaust and whatnot. The ones who are actually being subjected to a Holocaust are being called here. We are not subjecting anyone to a Holocaust. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, at the Nalsar debate, I specifically pointed out the number of sources which have recognized people who have served in that particular area in civil services, in security services and whatnot, who have clearly said that the talks, the writings and the intention of people from Bangladesh, rather their elected representatives, their bureaucrats, their ambassadors, their founding fathers, so to speak, everybody has spoken of a greater Bangladesh, which includes Assam. And therefore the history of this has to be traced necessarily to the partition of Bangladesh, of Bengal in 1905 by Lord Curzon, when this entire thing started. I cited books and whatnot. Unfortunately, perception is such an insurmountable barrier that it makes this adage look absolutely, I think it's appropriate, which is how do you wake up a man who's pretending to be asleep? You're throwing facts, you're throwing logic, but that's not going to make a difference because they start with bigotry, end with bigotry, and everything else in between is also bigotry, and they have nothing else to offer. Okay, that was the funny part. So I think this entire debate shows how people are being manipulated on the basis of emotions without any recognition of facts. 3, I think what needs to be understood is nobody in his right mind, in fact, can ever ask for expulsion of genuine Indian Muslims, people who are Indian citizens. Okay. In fact, that was the very object of the last talk, which is to say, this legislation has got nothing to do with expulsion of Indian Muslims. A legislation that speaks of including people who are being persecuted in Islamic republics has now been interpreted as a legislation for expulsion of Indian citizens, Indian Muslims. That is the extent to which they came out. So this effectively shows that it's not about this legislation. Something else is afoot. I think people can understand what's going on.
I think people should learn to look at this whole issue from the prism of justice.
Exactly.
Right? And when you talk about the partition, India chose to be secular, Pakistan chose to be a theocratic state, right, along with Bangladesh. Now, if there is a crisis there, right, if they've committed atrocities on their minorities, then India gets punished for choosing the right path.
Exactly.
Right? No one seems to be saying this, right?
Nobody seems to be actually asking Imran Khan, the so-called founder of Naya Pakistan and the one who's actually supposed to be telling India how to treat minorities, how does he explain the continued persecution of minorities and what steps he has actually taken after he has come to power to ensure that these minorities or their situation is as which they're alleviated. Statistics clearly show, on an average, in the most conservative figure, for the last 5 years, close to 5 to 10,000 Hindus have been fleeing Pakistan on an annual basis at the very least. Considering that they are merely 1.6 to 1.8% of the Pakistani population at this stage, that number is huge. That's a significant number. Let's assume for a moment. If from the population of India, that is 1.3 billion, if 10,000 minorities were to flee on the grounds of religious persecution, the percentage may be small, but the number in itself is significant. Correct? Absolutely. Compare that to the population of Pakistan and the population of Hindus within Pakistan and the number of Hindus fleeing from the particular population. It tells a huge story which nobody wants to talk about. Which human rights body, which NGO, which civil society group, which student body has deemed it fit to actually come out with a resolution castigating Pakistan for its treatment of minorities? They'll say that's an internal affair. Now here's the funny part. If that's an internal affair, the fight between Sunni Shias and Wahhabis and let's say Ahmadiyas within Pakistan is also an internal affair. Here's something I think that's even more important. Over the last 2 or 3 days, ever since this video went out, students across campuses, cutting across ideological lines, have been circulating this video. Frankly, you and I never thought that this would be the case. We just decided that something needs to be done. This fear-mongering needs a resistance, a pushback. That's why we came out with it. With all the calls we were getting. So now what is happening is, those students who are taking a position with respect to CAA, in support of CAA, are being hounded, are being blackmailed, are being stifled, and are being silenced, saying, how dare you come out with this particular position? Where is the talk of free speech, dissent, and alternative viewpoint, liberalism and whatnot, when you don't allow people to have a debate? They're actually saying, here are certain facts, let us debate. The topic is not even up for debate in campuses. And people come out with resolutions, and those resolutions are so, according to me, misleading, because clearly they don't represent the entire student population. If minority voice is so important, then the minority within voice, if at all it's a minority within that particular student community, also needs to be disseminated. They too need to have a voice. Why don't we see public debates happening in any of these campuses which are televised? Let people know where this issue actually stands and how many people are on which side of this particular issue. We don't get to see that at all. In my own fraternity, in the legal fraternity, so many people in the last few days have either whispered behind my backs or they've come up to me and congratulated me, and sometimes they end up having, they make a face, oh, this is the guy who made that video and whatnot. It's surprising. Some people watched the video and they wrote to me saying, you know what, we had a position before. Now I think there is more to actually think about. There is more food for thought. Then I said, okay, you were outraging all these days. Now that you've actually had an opportunity to change your position, why don't you tell the world that this is your current position? No, who wants a debate at hand? No, who wants to be ostracized, isolated, and marginalized? So much for the courage of their conviction to talk truth to the power, that the moment they see that the numbers are arrayed against them, nobody wants to talk about it. So while it is perfectly politically correct to outrage about this particular legislation, anybody who supports the legislation is a Sanghi, is a bigot, is a saffron, a terrorist, is a Nazi.
And it ultimately boils down to the fact that
the word Nazism has been so loosely used. So the country which is actually coming out with a legislation to protect persecuted minorities from its neighbors is being accused of Nazism, and the country which is actually persecuting them on an institutional basis, on a systematic basis through its official machinery, is being given a clean sheet. There's no discussion about it at all. If anything, this amendment at the very least should have started a discussion on the treatment of minorities in our neighborhood. That's a discussion that they should have started. And the convenient silence of, let's say, the Islamic republics of Pakistan and Bangladesh with respect to treatment of Muslims in China. They have never spoken about that, right? This entire hypocrisy has got a clean sheet.
One of the major concerns and repetitive questions that has come our way is if this is indeed based on the history of partition of India, how does Afghanistan figure into the scheme of things?
So, which is why you have to read the statement of objects and reasons of the bill. In fact, one person, I don't want to name the person, genuine question was the same thing. How do you actually justify inclusion of minorities from Afghanistan? Okay. And when there is no reference to this particular basis in the statement of objects and reasons, is the statement that was made. I was aghast at that particular statement and that assertion, that confident assertion, because para 2 of the statement of objects and reasons of the bill clearly says that because of transmigration of populations between these countries, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan and India, so undivided India and Afghanistan, okay, there are a good number of minorities in Afghanistan as well, and as a consequence of persecution, these minorities deserve to be included in this particular bill. Okay. Now, this is not an isolated reference which has come in for the very first time. One, people don't realize that India has been traditionally offering asylum and refuge to Afghans with the rise of Talibanization in that particular country and Islamic radicalism in that particular country, or Islamist radicalism, whichever way you see it. Okay. And since non-Muslims bear the brunt primarily of rise of Islamist radicalism, therefore, India had no other option but to consider giving them asylum and refuge, and that was done both for Muslims as well as for non-Muslims, and therefore both were given this particular treatment. Here, the specific object is to go after those people who are persecuted minorities and give them asylum on the basis of religion. The one thing that needs to be addressed here is, they might say, how did you come about with this particular arbitrary classification? Okay. Why are you limiting your scope only to this particular issue? One, this is a case of grant of citizenship to people who are illegal migrants turned refugees. Therefore, by default, it is done on a case-to-case basis. People can even ask about Sri Lankan Tamilians, right? The reason why Sri Lankan Tamils, according to me, have not yet been included is because situation in Sri Lanka has improved after the civil war in Sri Lanka. After the LTT has been wiped out, surely there must be some kind of sovereign assurance between the countries, and if they were continued to be persecuted, then I'm sure the government would have done something about it. More than anything, it is always done on a case-to-case basis. Here, this is the case that they have chosen to focus their energies on. That doesn't stop them from expanding the scope of this discussion in the future. And I think, as Mr. Salve rightly points out, and I think he has done a fabulous job, and I had an opportunity to go through his interview last night. And there he has clearly identified that treatment of all existing citizens is different from uniform treatment of everybody who comes from outside. That is the distinction that you must necessarily draw. That's where the Article 14 argument of the other side completely fails, falls and flounders. What has happened over, I think, over several years, or the last few years at least, is the utter lack of nuance in an Article 14 discussion. And that started off, according to me, even in cases relating to places of worship and entry into places of worship. Okay. So, if people can arbitrarily sit and craft what must constitute a class for the purposes of Article 14, here is a specific class which is identified on the basis of a historical fact, on the basis of an ongoing ground reality, which is that all these people are at the receiving end of religious persecution because they don't subscribe to the faith of that particular country where they come from. Okay. So Afghanistan has been included because there has always been a traditional migration of population between these two countries. That is something that para 2 of the statement of objects and reasons clearly mentions. So it's not as if they've arbitrarily included something. In fact, I mentioned something even in the last discussion about the Jews in Pakistan. The number of Jews in Pakistan is about 900 at this point. That's what it has come down to. Okay, so it doesn't mean that the government doesn't want Jews in this country. After all, we are the ones who have actually given Jews asylum for 2,000 years or over 2,000 years. So perhaps that is something that the government may consider. But to actually cast this expectation that a refugee policy or a citizenship policy must be all-inclusive, all-encompassing, without nuance, without any kind of discrimination, positive or negative, according to me, completely goes against the spirit of the concept of citizenship, both under the Constitution as well as under the Act.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. No, what I was saying is that it ultimately boils down to the fact that Hindus are a global minority.
I think this entire movement is reeking and smacking of Hinduphobia, according to me.
Yeah, and by virtue of being global minority, their rights are actually not protected. I mean, it was interesting you mentioned Pakistani Hindus. My own community, Kashmiri Pandits, it wasn't an insignificant number.
Right, 5 lakhs.
5 lakhs, yeah. 500,000 people got displaced, and there wasn't even a whimper from any of the establishment quarters.
Right.
So that is pretty much what Hindus are used to, and which has built a culture of silence, and a lot of people have spoken about it. In fact, we were working on one of these upcoming video scripts where we are talking about victimhood, right? And victimhood as an art and a science, right? Where it is an art because it needs a certain emotional appeal to be recognized as a victim, and you need to behave in certain ways. Absolutely. And it is a science because you need to have control over the broadcast mechanism. Absolutely.
You need
absolutely.
To have all
the academia.
Side even to actually say that you're a victim.
Absolutely. And if you are not an artist or a scientist in victimhood, you're probably a victim.
So you need to have a bunch of people in Bollywood who are, mostly unlettered and certainly legally unlettered. Then you need to have a couple of people from the academia who actually say the right things. Then you need to have a couple of student bodies effectively saying, yeah, this is the case. Frankly speaking, I think everybody in India has a right to oppose the CAA. Okay? Because the next question will be, are you saying we don't have the right to oppose? Of course you have the right to oppose. Go ahead, oppose it. But at least take into account facts, take into account history, take into account legal positions. You can't be a convenient constitutional patriot when it chooses you, and then you can't make an emotional appeal when it chooses you. That really doesn't make sense. In fact, here I think it's very important to respond to one more argument that was made. If you remember in the video, I clearly said that the government has the power to impose enhanced obligations on these illegal migrants turned refugees turned citizens, specifically saying that when they go through this transition, the government has the right to impose higher conditions. So some of these comments, I don't wish to attack any particular individual. I think people are entitled to their positions. I don't think there's a problem there at all. But let us see what is the level of the discourse. So when I pointed out the amended section, or rather 6B of the amended act, the person ended up asking on Twitter, where is the word enhanced conditions maintained? So in fact, I actually wanted to read this out. This is very, very important because it shows the level of ignorance, and that is why there is a difference between someone who hasn't practiced law or is a part-time practitioner and someone who practices on a regular basis and who knows how constitutional law works in action. I'm just reading this out for the people's benefit. After section 6A of the Principal Act, the following section shall be inserted. Namely, what does section 6B say? The central government or an authority specified by it in this behalf may, subject to such conditions, restrictions and manner as may be prescribed on an application made in this behalf, grant a certificate of registration or certificate of naturalization to a person referred to in the proviso of clause B of subsection 1 of subsection 2. What does this effectively show? Whether or not there are any enhanced conditions which are imposed at the current point of time or point in time, the government reserves the power to impose such enhanced obligations if it deems fit. What does it show? It only proves the point that even when it comes to Article 14 as it is applied to this particular case, enhanced standards can be applied to those citizens who are naturalized through this particular process, because the government needs to verify itself of their bona fides, okay, of their identity. So any point which I believe that a regular practitioner of law and someone who reads legislations on a daily basis, who practices in a court of law would have understood, people who have not practiced, who use their credentials as a lawyer only because they have an LLB degree for the purposes of gaining some kind of credibility to say, because I have an LLB degree, what I say necessarily makes sense. No, I'm sorry, that's not how it works. People who are practicing, you have to actually respect the particular fact that it goes beyond that. This, when I pointed out, the response to that was so hilarious. So I thought, should I even respond to it and dignify it? But the point is, that is the level of the discourse, unfortunately.
True.
Okay. Therefore, I have to go down to that particular level and expose, and I again repeat the word with a lot of responsibility, the utter stupidity of these positions. Okay. So, unfortunately, a milestone, a watershed in India's history, which should have generated two kinds of discussions. If we believe that what has happened to Hindu minorities and other minorities in Pakistan is wrong, how are we treating our minorities? That's a legitimate question to ask. You should have started the discussion, no problem. Similarly, why is it that these minorities in these two countries are being treated? What is the basis for it? What is the motivation for it? And why is that not happening in India? All these questions should have been asked. All of this, I think, according to me, is fair game. Unfortunately, the discussion has now gone to playing victim. And those people who are actually victims have no say in this process. None of these people have bothered to actually conduct an interview of any of these refugees, asking them, आपके साथ वहाँ पे क्या हुआ? आपको क्या महसूस हो रहा है? That favorite question. आप कैसे feel कर रहे हैं? Those questions should have been asked. Where were these people? Who has bothered to go to the refugee camps of Pakistani Hindu refugees in Delhi and ask them what are the conditions they live in? In fact, if they really wanted, let's say, some kind of ammunition against this government, they should have asked, have the conditions of these refugees improved after May 2014 when this government came into existence and came into power? That's a question that they could have asked. They never bothered to ask this question because these refugees are not their concern. They're looking for ammunition, political ammunition, chunavi mudda. I'm not saying everybody's like that though. We have to be very careful about one fact. Not everybody who opposes the CAA is necessarily anti-national, anti-Hindu or a Hindu-phobe. Okay? They may have legitimate grievances, they may have legitimate questions. However, the entire exhortation behind our initiative, so to speak, has been to say, at least argue on facts, argue on history, argue on reasonable principles of law, as opposed to conjuring principles out of thin air to push a certain point of view, merely because it is politically correct and merely because it's going to get you brownie points in your circles. That really doesn't make sense. Right. Taking a position against CAA doesn't make you a phobe of any kind, and taking a position for CAA also does not make you a phobe of any kind, because this is an instrumentality of inclusion and not exclusion.
So there is this discourse about CAA not being problematic in isolation, but if you combine it with NRC, then it becomes a problem. So what do you say? How do you respond to that?
See, here's the most important thing that people have to answer, and let me come to this first. So far, we still don't have a structure with respect to how the NRC is going to look on a nationwide basis, right? So what we have before us is how NRC was undertaken in Assam. Okay, we have some idea of it, right? So in my talks before, especially in the Nalsar debate, I specifically pointed out where does the NRC come from? It comes from the Citizenship Act, where there's a specific provision, Section 14A, that deals with it, and the rules for NRC have been framed under Section 18. I specifically said this on the Nalsar debate. Okay. Now, there are two specific provisions, one which deals with NRC for the rest of the country, and one which deals with special provisions for NRC for Assam. Okay. These are two different things. Now, here are the set of documents which were deemed as admissible for the purposes of NRC in Assam. And this is a printout from the Office of the State Coordinator of National Registration, Assam, NRC Assam, Government of Assam. What do they say? What are the admissible documents? There are two sets of documents, List A and List B. List A is supposed to show that you were present or your ancestor was present in Assam before the 24th of March 1971. What are the documents? The original NRC of 1951, or the electoral rolls up to 24th March 1971 midnight, land or tenancy records, citizenship certificate or permanent residential certificate, refugee registration certificate or passport or LIC or any government issued license certificate or government service stroke employment certificate or bank or post office accounts or birth certificate, board university education certificate or court records or processes. How many of us are actually worried that we don't have these documents? I really want to know.
No, I think that is the general discourse, because people tend to frame problems
for exceptions rather than for the...
So I'll come to that.
Yeah.
Assuming that you don't have these documents under list A, what does list B require? Birth certificate, land document, board university certificate, again bank, LIC, post office records, circle officer, GP secretary certificate in case of married women, electoral roll, ration card, or any other legally acceptable document. This is an omnibus requirement. How many of us are actually worried of this? So here's the funny part. People are actually saying anybody who comes into India, as long as he's a Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Jain, Parsi, or a Christian, he will immediately be entitled to this particular Amendment Act. He will be the beneficiary of this. Do you know what documents they actually have to deposit to actually prove that they are Pakistani nationals who are fleeing Pakistan, or Bangladeshi nationals who are fleeing Bangladesh, or Afghani nationals? So the point is, we don't know the process. We don't know the operational details, but we have assumed that they just have to come and say, "मैं हिंदू हूँ, गर्व से कहो तुम हिंदू हो, तुम्हें मिल जाएगा." Is that how it works? These people have to deposit their passports. There is an FRRO. There is a police station which does the verification. Take a look at the process. In fact, the government has said what? It is yet to come out with rules supporting this particular mechanism under the Amendment Act to establish what are the documents they need to present to prove their origins and their nationality. Okay, so let's tie this with the NRC aspect. Assume that NRC were to be undertaken in Coimbatore, in Tamil Nadu, okay, the so-called Dravidian land, okay. Assume for a moment that a Hindu is excluded from the particular process. How is he going to establish that he is from Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, and that he was in India before the 31st of December 2014? Let's take the persecuted minority from Kashmir. Can you establish that you're from Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan to get the benefit of the CAA? Can people from Rajasthan otherwise establish it? What are we really talking about? So what are they saying? No. The Home Minister has made a statement as part of his election speech that first we'll come out with the CAA and then we'll come out with the NRC. Does the CAA extend its application to a nationwide NRC? Not at all, because there's a cutoff date that you're supposed to meet. There are 3 countries from which you're supposed to come. You're supposed to establish that you've come from those places. Unless and until you do that, how are you the beneficiary of the CAA? Assume for a moment, and here's the interesting part, that you came to India after the 31st of December 2014 and you're a refugee, or let's say you're fleeing from Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan. Even then you are not entitled to this because there is a cutoff date. If you come to India and you've entered India after the 31st of December 2014 and you're a persecuted minority coming from these 6 communities, coming from these 3 states, even then you're not entitled to the benefit under this Amendment Act. That is the extent of this particular framework. That is the limited scope of this particular framework. 3, has the government so far established what are the rules with respect to the NRC for India? So let's take a look at the relevant provision. What is the relevant provision? You have to take a look at the Citizenship Registration of Citizens and Issue of National Identity Cards Rules of 2003, and the provision that you'll be looking at is Rule 4, which speaks of preparation of a national register of Indian citizens, which flows from Section 14 of the Citizenship Act. Okay. The Registrar General of Citizen Registration shall establish and maintain the National Register of Citizens, and what details it will contain is what it has said. The central government may, by an order issued in this regard, decide a date by which the population register shall be prepared by collecting information relating to all persons. Now, what notification has the government come out with respect to how the nationwide NRC will look like? Just as you have a list of documents that you are supposed to show for NRC Assam, do you have a similar notification for a nationwide NRC that is still in the works? So, to actually say that a current legislation, which is the CAA, which has a cutoff date of 31st of December 2014, will effectively extend its benefit to people of a future date if they get excluded from a nationwide NRC, boggles the mind. It's simple logic. I'm not even giving convoluted legal logic here, right? So, I certainly believe that people, it's okay. I don't expect people who are non-lawyers to know all of these things, which is why I said this document is not easy for the media to have discovered. It was not difficult for the media to have discovered the Citizenship Act or the documents which are necessary for NRC Assam or the cutoff dates for the CAA. Despite this, where is this fear-mongering coming from? What is the basis of this entire logic? So, which is why I believe that unfortunately this entire issue has been hijacked. I have no other option but to come to this inevitable, inescapable conclusion that this issue has been hijacked. There should have been any number of people. There will always be fringe elements who make an issue out of anything. But how are we generating this kind of mass hysteria, or at least projecting the existence of mass hysteria when there may be none? Perhaps there are only certain sections. Have we asked ourselves, who are these people who are actually rioting on the streets? So these questions need to be answered. I don't think there has been any discussion on facts. I think the only issue that perhaps we must consider discussing, subject to what you think, is the Assam Accord.
Also, the NRC, I think, is also very important because, like I mentioned about the impending crisis in Bangladesh, I think it looks towards the future rather than the past. Right? And it is an extremely important document, an extremely important step to secure the internal health and the internal dynamics of the country. So coming to, I think we'll close with this one because we're already past time. So do you want to bring in the Assam Accord?
See, the surprising part is when the CAA came out, there was a bit of a protest in Assam. They met the Home Minister, at least that's what the news reports say, and then they were given certain assurances. The concept of inner line permit was also extended to Manipur on the 13th of December 2019 by the President. After those assurances, they have now accepted, okay, this won't violate our legitimate considerations and our rights, and that the Assam Accord will be respected, right? So Assam has gone silent now. So who are these people fighting now? People in Delhi, people in academic campuses. In the name of who? Assamese. So Assamese have accepted that this particular act will not violate the constitutional promises made to them and the promises made to them under the accord. They have not asked this question. It is important for us to actually get into a bit of history. I will not take more than 30 seconds on this. Assam Sanmilit Mahasangh, which is Assam Public Works, I think that's what it broadly translates to, has filed a petition before the Supreme Court challenging Section 6A of the Citizenship Act, where the provision actually extends the cutoff date for Assam for detection and deportation of illegal migrants, wherein people between 1966 and 1971 are also being regularized. They have a problem with that particular aspect. They're saying, take us back to 1951. Why is there a special treatment and a differential treatment for Assam? Who is the president of ASM? If you read the judgment, there is a gentleman by the name Motiur Rahman. Okay? So, who is actually bringing religion into this? So, Assam Sanmilit Mahasangh speaks on behalf of the tribal population as well as the non-tribal population. People should just read this judgment. It's publicly available, 17th of December 2014, which captures the entire history of this problem. And you realize that the people of Assam, regardless of faith, are genuinely saying that kindly protect our ethnic identity and indigenous identity, and at the very least share the burden of refugees who come under the ambit of CAA so that we don't stand to lose our identity. Once that assurance seems to have been given by the Home Minister as part of his meetings, they have accepted it on face value. So now somebody else is riding on the coattails of Assamese sentiments in their name, on their behalf, when they've gone silent. So I think people just need to read these documents. They're publicly available. And before we go down the path of using words like bigot and Sanghi and whatnot and stooge and all that, at the very least, considering that you actually think you're paragons of decency and dignity because you come from the left, okay, observe that particular decorum in your discussions. If you start a discussion with an allegation of bigotry, you're bound to get punches, okay, at least metaphorically speaking. But if you start a discussion on civil lines, let's say on at least with politeness and with dignity, some response will come which is dignified in nature. You start the entire discussion with bigotry, that means there is no room for discussion after that.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. These labels are thrown to just shut people up. And it is very similar to how Pakistan and India are dealing with each other. Pakistan has the right to do whatever they want, and India is supposed to take all the nonsense and still behave decently. So I think as inheritors of the Indian civilization, I think it's a burden. It's a civilization burden that we carry.
Decent for our own good.
So with that, I think we'll wind this one up, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot more questions which will come up, and maybe it'll give us an opportunity to do another episode of Clear Cut.
Right.
Till then, goodbye, and hope this enlightened you. Thank you.